A chance encounter. The private terminal hummed with subdued luxury, its polished marble floors reflecting the soft morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. Sleek leather armchairs lined the spacious lounge, occupied by a smattering of sharply dressed business travelers and the occasional celebrity hoping to avoid the chaos of commercial airports. Elliot Harper strode through the automatic glass doors, his presence commanding attention without effort. At 44 years old, Elliot was the epitome of success. A self-made billionaire and founder of HarperTech, he had transformed the way the world interacted with technology. He was known for his sharp mind, unshakable determination, and a knack for spotting opportunity where others saw none. Today, however, Elliot's focus was on something far more personal, a weekend retreat in the Bahamas to celebrate his mother's 70th birthday. Dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, he cut an imposing figure. His deep brown skin seemed to gleam under the light, a testament to the care he took in maintaining his appearance. A subtle but expensive watch adorned his wrist, a gift from his late father, and his leather duffel bag was slung casually over his shoulder. Beside him walked Miranda Lowe, his chief of staff. Miranda was a whirlwind of efficiency, armed with a tablet that seemed permanently attached to her hand. Her sharp wit and impeccable organization had been instrumental in navigating the complexities of Elliot's empire. Today, she wore a muted green blouse and black trousers, her demeanor as polished as her appearance. "Flights confirmed, and the pilots ready to depart as soon as we board," Miranda informed him, her tone clipped yet warm. "We're ahead of schedule for once. That's got to be a first." Elliot chuckled. "Let's not jinx it." As they approached the private boarding gate, a uniformed staff member intercepted them. She was a petite woman with an overly crisp demeanor, her name tag identifying her as C. Reynolds. Her sharp gaze flickered over them, her expression morphing from professional indifference to something uncomfortably close to disdain. "May I help you?" she asked, her tone as frigid as the air-conditioned lounge. "Good morning," Elliot began, his deep voice calm. "We're here for the 9:30 charter to Nassau. HarperTech's Gulfstream G650. Here are our boarding passes and identification." Elliot handed over the documents, his easy confidence unwavering. However, the woman didn't bother to look at the papers. Instead, she glanced up, her eyes narrowing as if appraising his worth. "I'm sorry, sir," she said after a long pause, her voice dripping with condescension. "There seems to be an issue. This terminal is for private charter clients only." Elliot frowned, puzzled. "I'm aware. That's why we're here." Reynolds didn't budge. "You must be mistaken. This area is reserved for a certain caliber of traveler. Perhaps you should try the commercial terminal." Miranda's jaw dropped. "Excuse me? Mr. Harper is a registered passenger. This is his aircraft." Reynolds remained unmoved, her posture stiffening. "I'll need to confirm that." Elliot felt a familiar knot tighten in his stomach. He had experienced moments like this before, moments where his wealth, his success, and his achievements were invisible to those who saw only his skin color. But this was different. This wasn't an accidental slight or an unthinking remark. This was deliberate. "Is there a problem with the paperwork?" Elliot asked, keeping his voice steady despite the growing anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. "It's not about paperwork," Reynolds replied, her tone growing colder. "We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone who doesn't meet our standards." Miranda stepped forward, her voice rising. "What does that even mean? Are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," Reynolds interrupted, leaning in slightly, "that some people don't belong here." The words hung in the air like a foul stench. A hush fell over the lounge as other travelers began to notice the confrontation. Curious eyes turned toward them, some sympathetic, others simply entertained by the unfolding drama. Elliot's grip tightened around the strap of his duffel bag. He felt the weight of 1,000 assumptions pressing down on him. The urge to lash out, to demand respect, burned within him, but years of navigating prejudice had taught him restraint. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to maintain control. "Miranda," he said quietly, "let's step aside." "Step aside?" Miranda echoed, incredulous. "Elliot, this is ridiculous. You don't have to." "Let's step aside," he repeated, his tone firm. He turned away from the counter, walking toward a quieter corner of the terminal. Miranda followed, her heels clicking against the floor with angry determination. Once they were out of earshot, Miranda exploded. "This is insane. She has no right." "I know," Elliot interrupted, his voice low but laced with steel. "But losing my temper won't fix this. Not here. Not now." "Then what's the plan?" Miranda demanded. "Because we're not letting this slide." Elliot sank into one of the leather chairs, his posture deceptively relaxed. His mind, however, was racing. He glanced back at the counter, where Reynolds was now engaged in a hushed conversation with another staff member. The smug look on her face was enough to reignite his anger. "We document everything," Elliot said finally. "Her name, her exact words, the time, the witnesses. Then we dig deeper. I want to know who runs this terminal, who employs her, and what policies they think justify this behavior." Miranda nodded, already tapping away on her tablet. "I'll pull up the terminal's management structure and see if there's a history of complaints. Should I alert the PR team?" "Not yet," Elliot replied. "This isn't just about me. If this is how they treat their clients, imagine how they treat people without the resources to fight back. We're going to make this right, but we'll do it strategically." Just then, a man in a gray suit approached them. His expression was a mix of nervousness and regret. "Mr. Harper?" he asked cautiously. Elliot looked up, his gaze cool. "Yes. My name is David Langston. I'm the terminal's operations manager. I heard there was an issue." He hesitated, clearly aware of the tension in the air. "I'd like to personally apologize for any inconvenience." "Inconvenience?" Miranda snapped, her tone sharp. "Your staff humiliated him in front of half the terminal." Langston winced. "I assure you, this doesn't reflect our company's values. I'll personally ensure you're boarded immediately." Elliot held up a hand, silencing Miranda before she could respond. "Apologies are easy, Mr. Langston. Change is not. Let's see how your company handles this before I decide how to proceed." Langston nodded, his face pale. "Of course. We'll address this immediately." As Langston hurried away, Elliot leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Miranda studied him for a moment, then asked, "You're planning something, aren't you?" Elliot's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "Let's just say I don't believe in letting teachable moments go to waste." The storm beneath the calm. Elliot Harper sat in the opulent lounge of the private terminal, his fingers steepled beneath his chin as he stared out of the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. The luxury of the terminal, gleaming marble, designer furniture, and a staff trained to cater to the world's elite, now seemed a facade masking an uglier reality. The humiliation he had just endured burned fresh in his mind. The air was crisp with the faint scent of expensive cologne and freshly brewed coffee. Yet for Elliot, it smelled of something more insidious. Injustice. Miranda sat opposite him, furiously typing on her tablet. The tension between them was palpable, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic tapping of her fingers against the screen. "They're scrambling," Miranda said finally, glancing up. Her voice carried both frustration and determination. "The operations manager is contacting corporate. I saw him disappear into one of the offices with a phone glued to his ear. They know they messed up." Elliot leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful but hard. Knowing and caring are two different things. This wasn't just a bad decision by one staff member. It felt systemic, like she knew she could act that way without consequence. Miranda nodded. It wasn't just about power. It was about knowing the system would back her up. Elliot's gaze shifted back to the window, where a line of sleek private jets waited on the tarmac, engines silent, their polished exteriors reflecting the sunlight. Somewhere out there, His Gulfstream sat idle, its crew waiting for clearance to depart. He thought of his mother, likely already in Nassau, preparing for the celebration. She had spent her life teaching him resilience, instilling in him a sense of dignity that no amount of prejudice could erode. But today, even her lessons felt insufficient against the weight of the insult. "What do we know about this airline?" he asked abruptly, breaking the silence. Miranda didn't miss a beat. Elite Aviation Group owns this terminal and several others around the country. They operate as a luxury concierge service for private travelers. Think executives, celebrities, and VIPs. Their parent company, Apex Aeronautics, is one of the largest private aviation firms in the world. Annual revenue is in the billions. Elliot's lips pressed into a thin line. "And their track record, that's where things get interesting," Miranda replied, her voice lowering as though sharing a secret. "There's not much public controversy, at least not on the surface. But dig a little deeper and you start to find cracks. There have been whispers of discriminatory practices, mostly on forums and social media. Passengers of color being delayed or denied service without cause. Most of it is buried under NDAs and settlements, so it never gets traction in the press." Elliot absorbed the information, his sharp mind already piecing together a plan. "And the management?" Miranda swiped through her notes. "The CEO of Apex Aeronautics is Victor Layton. Old money, Ivy League, the usual pedigree. His board is a mix of industry veterans and investors, but there's little diversity among them. No surprises there." Elliot's jaw tightened. He knew the type. Men like Layton often lived in bubbles of privilege, blind to the injustices perpetuated under their watch. He thought of Reynolds, the staff member who had denied him boarding. Her smugness wasn't born of ignorance. It was cultivated, a product of an environment that tolerated or even encouraged such behavior. As he sat there, a new determination took hold. This wasn't just about his experience. It was about exposing and dismantling the culture that allowed it to happen. "Let's make this personal," Elliot said finally, his voice calm but firm. "I want everything on Victor Layton. His background, his connections, his vulnerabilities. If he's at the top of this pyramid, he's the one who needs to answer for it." Miranda raised an eyebrow. "You're planning to go after him directly?" Elliot's eyes darkened. "I'm planning to make him understand that this behavior has consequences." Behind closed doors, while Elliot and Miranda strategized, chaos erupted in the operations office of the terminal. David Langston, the regional operations manager, was on the phone with Apex Aeronautics corporate headquarters. His usually composed demeanor had given way to panic, his face flushed, and his voice strained. "This is a disaster," Langston hissed into the receiver. "Do you even know who he is?" "Elliot Harper. Billionaire. Tech visionary. His name alone could bury us." The voice on the other end, belonging to Apex's chief of legal affairs, was curt. "We need to control the narrative. Whatever happens, this can't hit the media." Langston ran a hand through his hair. "He's not just going to walk away from this. The man's a shark. He built Harpertech from nothing. If he decides to go public, then make sure he doesn't." The legal officer interrupted. "Offer him whatever it takes to smooth this over. A formal apology, a free flight, a charity donation in his name, whatever he wants." Langston glanced at the security footage on his monitor. Elliot sat in the lounge, his posture deceptively relaxed, but his expression unreadable. Langston felt a chill run down his spine. Elliot wasn't the type to be bought off with platitudes or perks. This was going to take more than damage control. "What about Reynolds?" Langston asked, his voice low. "She's the one who escalated this." The legal officer hesitated. "If we need a scapegoat, we'll use her, but not yet. For now, focus on Harper. Do whatever it takes to keep him quiet." Langston hung up, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He knew he was walking the tightrope. One misstep, and the entire incident could blow up in their faces. Digging deeper. Back in the lounge, Miranda's fingers flew across her tablet, pulling up financial reports, board member profiles, and archived news articles. Beside her, Elliot reviewed the information she uncovered, his mind working through the implications of each piece. They're in talks with the Department of Defense for a lucrative logistics contract, Miranda noted, tapping on an article. If word gets out about systemic discrimination, it could jeopardize the deal. Good, Elliot replied, his tone sharp. That gives us leverage. Miranda glanced at him, her expression cautious. Are you sure you want to go this far? Once we start pulling threads, there's no turning back. Elliot met her gaze, his expression resolute. This isn't just about me, Miranda. It's about everyone they've marginalized and dismissed. If we don't hold them accountable, who will? Miranda nodded, her respect for him deepening. Then let's make sure we do it right. As they worked, Elliot's phone buzzed. It was a message from his mother. Hope you're on your way, sweetheart. Can't wait to see you. Love you. He stared at the words for a moment, the warmth of her love momentarily softening the steel in his resolve. Then he typed a quick reply. Running a bit late, Mom. I'll explain when I see you. Love you too. The message sent, Elliot turned back to Miranda. What's next? Miranda smiled faintly. We keep digging. If they think they can bury this, they're in for a rude awakening. Elliot nodded. He wasn't just planning to fight back. He was planning to win. The roots of the problem. As Miranda continued her research, her focus shifted to public records and employee testimonials. The airline's track record painted a picture that mirrored Reynolds' behavior, a culture of elitism and exclusion that wasn't explicitly stated but deeply ingrained in its operations. Listen to this, Miranda said, reading aloud from a forum post. I'm a senior project manager for a Fortune 500 company. I fly private regularly, but elite aviation always finds a reason to question me about my credentials. The last time, they refused me entry until my CEO personally called to confirm my role. This post is from 2 years ago. Elliot frowned. 2 years, and nothing's changed. They're either arrogant or completely indifferent. Miranda clicked through another page, her brow furrowing. There's more. Here's a comment. They made me wait in the lounge for hours, saying there was a paperwork issue. Meanwhile, passengers arriving after me were boarded immediately. I eventually realized I was the only person of color in the lounge. Elliot exhaled sharply. It's a pattern, and they've been getting away with it because their clientele is mostly affluent and unlikely to make a public fuss. Miranda nodded. Exactly. And when someone does push back, they settle quickly and quietly. No headlines, no lawsuits. Elliot leaned forward, his hands clasped together. That ends today. The unexpected visitor. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a man in an impeccably tailored navy suit. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, and his demeanor radiated authority. He extended a hand toward Elliot, who hesitated before shaking it. Mr. Harper, the man began, his voice smooth but cautious. I'm Victor Layton, CEO of Apex Aeronautics. I flew in from New York as soon as I heard about the incident. I'd like to personally apologize on behalf of my company. Elliot raised an eyebrow, his expression neutral. That was quick. Layton smiled thinly. We pride ourselves on efficiency, though I wish it were under better circumstances. I assure you, the behavior you experienced is not representative of our values. Miranda crossed her arms, unimpressed. Your values? You mean the ones that allow your staff to openly discriminate against passengers? Layton's smile faltered. Ms. Lowe, I understand your frustration. What happened was unacceptable, and I'd already initiated an internal review to ensure it doesn't happen again. Elliot leaned back in his chair, studying Layton carefully. An internal review. That's it. Layton shifted uncomfortably under Elliot's gaze. We're committed to addressing this matter thoroughly. In the meantime, I'd like to offer our sincerest apologies and ensure your immediate departure to Nassau. The jet is ready whenever you are. Elliot's expression didn't waver. Apologies are easy, Mr. Layton. Accountability is harder. What happens to Reynolds and her supervisor? What happens to the policies that allowed this to occur in the first place? Layton hesitated. Reynolds' behavior was clearly inappropriate. She'll be disciplined, possibly terminated. As for our policies, I'm personally reviewing them to ensure we uphold the highest standards of service. Miranda spoke up, her tone sharp. How many other incidents like this have been disciplined without any real change? Because from what we found, this isn't an isolated case. Layton's face paled slightly. I'm not aware of any systemic issues, but I assure you. Elliot interrupted, his voice calm but firm. You're aware now, and I suggest you start taking it seriously. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's been treated the way I was today. If you think a few platitudes and a free flight will make this go away, you're mistaken. Layton's jaw tightened, and for the first time, his polished demeanor cracked. Mr. Harper, we value your business. I hope we can resolve this amicably. Elliot stood, his presence towering even without raising his voice. I value justice, Mr. Layton. Amicable resolutions don't mean much without real accountability. You have my contact information. If you're serious about making this right, you'll know how to reach me. Without waiting for a response, Elliot turned and walked toward the boarding area. Miranda followed, her expression a mix of satisfaction and defiance. The flight to resolve. As the Gulfstream's engines roared to life and the jet began its taxi down the runway, Elliot gazed out of the window. The city below shrank as they ascended into the sky, but the weight of the morning's events lingered. You handled that well, Miranda said, breaking the silence. Layton wasn't expecting you to push back that hard. Elliot smirked faintly. Bullies rarely do, but this isn't over. Not by a long shot. Miranda nodded, already drafting follow-up notes on her tablet. What's the next step? We expose the truth, Elliot replied. If they want to sweep this under the rug, we'll make sure the rug is pulled out from under them. Reach out to those passengers who shared their stories online. Offer them support, legal representation, whatever they need. Let's turn their voices into something Apex can't ignore. Miranda's eyes gleamed with determination. Done. And what about Layton? Elliot's gaze hardened. He thinks this is just a PR issue. We'll show him it's much more than that. This isn't just about reputational damage. It's about systemic change. As the jet leveled off at cruising altitude, Elliot leaned back in his seat, his mind already working through the strategy ahead. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had been silenced, dismissed, or overlooked. And this fight was only beginning. Unearthing the shadows, the hum of the Gulfstream's engines filled the cabin as it soared over the Atlantic, its path cutting a direct line toward the Bahamas. Elliot Harper leaned back in his seat, his tablet balanced on his lap. The sunlight streaming through the window highlighted the intensity in his eyes as he scrolled through documents Miranda had sent over. Miranda sat across from him, her focus unwavering. Her tablet was open to a spreadsheet, filled with names, dates, and incidents they'd managed to uncover in the few hours since the confrontation at the terminal. The deeper they dug, the more unsettling the picture became. It's worse than we thought, Miranda said, breaking the silence. She gestured toward her screen. Over a dozen similar incidents across 5 different terminals, all owned or operated by elite aviation. Most involve passengers of color or those perceived to be out of place in a luxury setting. Elliot frowned, his fingers tightening around the edges of his tablet. How has this stayed under the radar? Miranda glanced up, her expression grim. Money. Settlements. NDAs. The elite aviation has a legal team that knows how to make problems disappear. Victims are either compensated into silence or buried under legal threats. It's not just systematic, it's deliberate. Elliot exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. They've built an empire on exclusivity, but it's a thinly veiled excuse for discrimination. If this is how they treat paying clients, Imagine how they treat employees. Miranda nodded. I thought the same thing. I've started looking into employee reviews and whistleblower forums. So far, I've found complaints about biased hiring practices, unequal pay, and a boys' club culture at the executive level. Elliot's eyes narrowed. And Apex Aeronautics. They're even more insulated, Miranda replied, tapping on her tablet. Elite Aviation is technically a subsidiary, so Apex can claim plausible deniability. But the culture starts at the top. Victor Layton's leadership has set the tone. Elliot's lips pressed into a thin line. Layton thinks he can play the unaware CEO card. Let's make sure he doesn't get the chance. Digging into the past, Miranda adjusted her posture, switching to a new document. I pulled some public records on Victor Layton. His tenure at Apex started 15 years ago, after he inherited the company from his father. Before that, Apex was primarily focused on cargo and logistics. Layton is the one who pivoted them into luxury private aviation. Elliot arched an eyebrow. So this culture of exclusivity is his brainchild. Pretty much, Miranda confirmed. He marketed Apex as the pinnacle of high society, creating an image that appeals to the ultra-wealthy. But that image comes with gatekeeping, and the gatekeepers are people like Reynolds. Elliot considered this, his mind working through the implications. What about his personal life? Connections, vulnerabilities. Miranda hesitated. He's careful, but not untouchable. He's a major donor to several high-profile charities, mostly in education and the arts. On the surface, he looks like the model philanthropist. Elliot smirked faintly. The kind of person who uses charity to polish his public image. Exactly, Miranda said. But there's one thing that stood out. His company has been lobbying for a massive Department of Defense contract. It's worth billions, and if they secure it, it'll cement Apex's dominance in the private aviation market. Elliot leaned forward, his interest piqued. How far along are they? Still in negotiations, Miranda replied. But any negative press could jeopardize their chances. The DOD won't want to associate with a company embroiled in scandal. Elliot's smirk turned into a full-fledged grin. Leverage, the personal connection. The flight attendant approached, placing 2 glasses of sparkling water on the table between them. Elliot sipped his drink thoughtfully, his mind drifting to his mother. She had raised him in a modest home in Atlanta, working 2 jobs to support him after his father passed away. Her sacrifices had fueled his drive to succeed, but they also instilled in him a deep sense of justice. He thought back to her lessons about dignity and resilience. Whenever he faced adversity, her words echoed in his mind. You can't control how the world treats you, but you can control how you respond. This time, responding meant more than walking away. It meant taking action, not just for himself, but for others who had been silenced. Miranda interrupted his thoughts. I also found something interesting about Reynolds. Elliot looked up. Go on. She's not just some rogue employee, Miranda said, her tone grave. She's been with Elite Aviation for over a decade. Her personnel file is spotless, but there are internal complaints about her behavior, most of them mysteriously dropped or unresolved. It looks like she has connections higher up. Elliot's expression darkened. She feels protected because she is. That arrogance didn't come from nowhere. Miranda nodded. Exactly. If we want to dismantle this culture, we need to expose not just the policies but the people who enforce and enable them. Elliot's gaze sharpened. Then let's start with Reynolds. I want to know everything about her, her background, her connections, even her social media footprint. If she's part of the problem, we'll make sure she's held accountable. Building the case. For the remainder of the flight, Elliot and Miranda worked tirelessly, compiling a dossier on Elite Aviation, Apex Aeronautics, and the individuals at the center of the controversy. By the time the jet began its descent into Nassau, they had a comprehensive picture of the systemic issues plaguing the company. Elliot leaned back in his seat, satisfied with their progress. This is just the beginning, he said. We've built the foundation, but now we need to execute. Miranda closed her tablet, her expression resolute. What's the plan? First, we reach out to the victims, Elliot replied. We gather their stories, their evidence, and their support. Then we bring in the media. Not just for headlines, but for a deeper investigation. This isn't about a single incident. It's about exposing a culture. And Leighton? Miranda asked. Elliot's eyes gleamed with determination. He built this system, so he's going to answer for it. Publicly. A new resolve. As the Gulf Stream touched down in Nassau, Elliot felt a renewed sense of purpose. The warm Caribbean air greeted him as he stepped off the jet, but his mind was already focused on the battle ahead. This wasn't just about confronting an airline or a CEO. It was about challenging a system that thrived on exclusion and discrimination. Miranda joined him at the bottom of the stairs, her tablet in hand. Your mother's waiting at the villa, she said, smiling faintly. Ready for a break. Elliot chuckled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. A short one. Then we get back to work. Together, they walked toward the waiting car, the sun setting behind them. It painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, a reminder that even in the face of injustice, there was beauty worth fighting for. A ripple becomes a wave. Elliot Harper sat in the outdoor courtyard of his family's villa in Nassau, the rhythmic crash of waves in the distance offering a brief respite from the weight of his thoughts. His mother, Evelyn Harper, watched him with a mix of pride and concern as she stirred her tea. The celebration for her 70th birthday had been intimate and joyous, filled with laughter and heartfelt toasts. But Evelyn knew her son too well to miss the undercurrent of intensity in his demeanor. You're quiet tonight, Evelyn said gently, breaking the silence. Her voice carried the soothing cadence of wisdom earned through years of challenges. Something on your mind? Elliot looked up, his expression softening as he met her gaze. Just work, he replied, though the weight behind the words was unmistakable. Evelyn tilted her head, unconvinced. The kind of work that keeps you up at night, or the kind that sets your soul on fire. Elliot chuckled, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly. Maybe a bit of both. Evelyn sipped her tea, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. You've always carried the world on your shoulders, Elliot. But don't forget, you don't have to do it alone. He nodded, her words resonating deeply. Evelyn had been his anchor through life's storms, a reminder that resilience wasn't a solitary pursuit. He reached across the table to squeeze her hand briefly before rising to his feet. I'll try to remember that, he said. But right now, there's work to do. Mobilizing the voices. Back inside the villa, Miranda was stationed in the living room, her laptop open and her phone buzzing intermittently. The makeshift war room was an organized chaos of digital files, spreadsheets, and email drafts. She looked up as Elliot entered, her expression a mixture of determination and exhaustion. Updates? Elliot asked, his voice crisp but measured. Miranda gestured toward her screen. I've contacted 6 individuals who shared their stories online about elite aviation. 4 have responded positively. They're willing to talk, but they're understandably cautious. Most of them signed NDAs when they settled with the company. Elliot frowned. What about the others? 1 declined outright, said they didn't want to risk being targeted again. The last one hasn't responded yet, but I'm following up. Miranda paused, then added, I also reached out to a couple of journalists who specialize in investigative reporting. They're interested but want something concrete before committing. Elliot nodded, his mind racing. We need to give them that. If those NDAs are stopping people from speaking out, we'll find a way to counter them. And we'll need to provide these journalists with more than just stories. Hard evidence, documents, patterns, something they can't ignore. Miranda leaned back, rubbing her temples. I've started cross-referencing incident reports with the company's financials and internal policies. It's slow work, but there's a trail. Elite aviation settlements show up as customer relations expenses, which spiked disproportionately in quarters when public complaints were at their highest. Elliot's eyes narrowed. That's a lead. If we can connect those spikes to specific incidents, we might have the proof we need. The unexpected ally. As they worked late into the night, Elliot's phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. He hesitated briefly before answering. "This is Elliot Harper," he said. The voice on the other end was steady but cautious. "Mr. Harper, my name is James Chen. I believe we met briefly at the terminal. I witnessed what happened." Elliot straightened in his chair, recognizing the name immediately. James Chen was the CEO of Pacific Ventures, a major player in global finance. His presence at the terminal had been a fleeting observation, but now, it seemed, he was stepping into the fray. "I appreciate you reaching out," Elliot said. "What can I do for you?" "It's more about what I can do for you," Chen replied. "What I saw was unacceptable, and it's not the first time I've encountered something like it with elite aviation. I've had clients and colleagues report similar issues over the years. If you're planning to address this, I'd like to help." Elliot exchanged a glance with Miranda, who immediately started taking notes. "Your support could make a significant difference," Elliot said. "What are you offering?" Chen hesitated for a moment. "I have access to resources that might be useful. Legal counsel, media contacts, even data analysts. And I'm willing to speak out publicly if it comes to that. But I need to know your approach first." Elliot appreciated the caution. "We're building a case," he explained. "Stories from victims, evidence of systemic practices, and financial patterns that expose how they've buried these issues. The goal is to force accountability at the highest level." Chen was silent for a moment, then said, "I'll have my team send over what we have. It might not be much, but it's a start. Let me know if there's anything else you need." "Thank you, James," Elliot said sincerely. "This fight is bigger than any one of us, but together, we stand a better chance." As the call ended, Miranda raised an eyebrow. "That's a powerful ally." Elliot nodded, "And exactly the kind of voice we need to amplify this. Let's make sure he's looped in on every development. A glimpse into the machine." The next morning, Miranda uncovered another significant lead. While sifting through employee reviews and whistleblower forums, she stumbled upon a former elite aviation manager willing to talk anonymously. "I've got a live lead," Miranda said, holding up her phone. "Former employee. Says he was fired for speaking out of turn about discriminatory practices." Elliot's interest peaked. "What's his story?" Miranda dialed the number, putting the call on speaker. A gravelly voice answered. "Hello. This is Miranda Lowe, Chief of Staff for Elliot Harper. Is this Mr. Fletcher?" "That's me," the man replied cautiously. "You said you wanted to talk about elite aviation." "Yes," Miranda said. "We're investigating a pattern of discrimination and systemic bias within the company. Your name came up as someone who might have insight." Fletcher exhaled audibly. "I figured it was only a matter of time before someone started asking questions. What do you want to know?" "Everything," Elliot interjected. "What you saw, what you experienced, and why you think the system operates the way it does." Fletcher hesitated, then said, "The culture at Elite isn't an accident. It's a direct reflection of the leadership. From the top down, there's an unspoken rule about maintaining a certain image. That's code for keeping people who don't fit their mold out of sight." Elliot frowned. "And Reynolds, the staff member who denied me boarding. She's a favorite," Fletcher said bitterly. "Management loves her because she enforces their standards without question. She's been reported more times than I can count, but nothing ever sticks. They protect her because she does their dirty work." Miranda typed furiously, capturing every detail. "Do you have proof? Emails, documents, anything that ties these practices to the leadership?" "I kept some records," Fletcher admitted. "Not much, but enough to show a pattern. I can send them over, but I'm risking a lot by talking to you." "We'll protect your identity," Elliot assured him. "And if you're targeted for speaking out, We'll make sure you have the legal and financial support you need. Fletcher sighed. All right, I'll send what I have. But be careful. These people play dirty. Turning the tide. As the call ended, Elliot felt a surge of determination. They were building momentum, uncovering pieces of a puzzle that had been carefully hidden for years. The ripple was becoming a wave, and soon it would be impossible to ignore. Miranda, Elliot said, his voice steady. We're close. Let's push harder. I want every piece of evidence in place before we go public. This ends with accountability. Miranda nodded, her eyes gleaming with purpose. Let's make it happen. As the sun rose higher over Nassau, casting its golden light across the villa, Elliot knew they were on the brink of something transformative. This wasn't just about justice, it was about creating a legacy of change. And he wouldn't stop until the walls of prejudice came crashing down. A deeper look inside Elite Aviation. After the call with Fletcher, Elliot and Miranda dove back into their growing cache of evidence. The former employee's information had added crucial context to what they were uncovering, painting a damning picture of a company whose outward sophistication masked a deeply flawed internal culture. Miranda typed furiously on her laptop, connecting the dots between Fletcher's testimony and the financial irregularities she had uncovered earlier. This is starting to make sense, she said, her tone sharp. Elite Aviation's so-called customer relations expenses align almost perfectly with the timeframes Fletcher mentioned, when complaints against Reynolds and others were at their highest. Elliot leaned over her shoulder, scanning the screen. So they've been using settlements to paper over their problems, while protecting the perpetrators. Exactly, Miranda replied. It's not just about negligence. It's a coordinated effort to preserve their image at any cost. Elliot straightened, his mind already racing. We need to quantify this. If their financial records show a pattern, it's not just circumstantial, it's evidence. Miranda nodded. I'll flag this for the forensic accountant we're working with. We'll need a full analysis before we take this public. The turning point. Later that afternoon, James Chen sent over the first batch of documents from his team. Among them were internal emails from Elite Aviation's management, obtained through whistleblowers. As Elliot and Miranda reviewed them, one email stood out. The subject line read, "Reinforcing our standards," and was addressed to senior staff at multiple terminals. It contained thinly veiled instructions to prioritize high-value clientele who reflect the company's image, and to use discretion when handling unusual passengers. Elliot's jaw tightened as he read the words. Unusual passengers, he repeated. That's how they justify their prejudice. Miranda's expression darkened. It's vague enough to give them plausible deniability, but the intent is clear. Elliot placed the email in a separate folder marked Key Evidence. This is the smoking gun we needed. When paired with Fletcher's testimony and the financial patterns, it proves their practices are systemic. Empowering the victims. That evening, Elliot and Miranda set up a series of virtual meetings with the victims who had agreed to speak out. Using encrypted communication platforms to ensure their privacy, they began collecting detailed accounts of the discrimination these individuals had faced. The stories were heartbreaking and infuriating. One woman, a corporate attorney, described how she was detained at a terminal for hours, her credentials questioned repeatedly despite being a frequent flyer. Another man, an entrepreneur, recounted how he was told he didn't look like someone who owned a jet and was escorted out of the lounge. Each story added another layer to the growing case. Miranda meticulously recorded every detail, creating a timeline that linked the incidents to the broader patterns they were uncovering. These people are brave, Miranda said after the last meeting. Sharing their stories puts them at risk, especially with those NDAs hanging over them. Elliot nodded. That's why we have to protect them. Once this goes public, Elite Aviation will try to discredit everyone involved. We need to be ready. The legal push. The next morning, Elliot contacted his legal team, a group of top-tier attorneys who had handled some of Harpertech's most complex cases. He outlined the situation and asked them to focus on two objectives: challenging the enforceability of the NDAs and preparing for potential retaliation from Elite Aviation. These NDAs are a critical barrier, Elliott explained during a video conference with the lead attorney, Melissa Trent. If we can show they were used to suppress evidence of systemic discrimination, we can argue they're unenforceable. Melissa nodded. It's a strong angle, especially if we can tie it to a broader pattern of misconduct. I'll put our best people on it. Elliott's expression was steely. Good. I want this airtight. When we move, it has to be decisive. Rallying support. As the legal team got to work, Elliott and Miranda turned their attention to building public support for their case. They reached out to advocacy groups specializing in workplace discrimination and corporate accountability, sharing their findings and asking for guidance on how to amplify the issue. One of the groups, the Center for Corporate Justice, responded enthusiastically. Their director, a fiery lawyer named Carla Reyes, offered to coordinate a coalition of activists and media outlets to bring attention to the case. This is exactly the kind of fight we were built for, Carla said during a call with Elliott. We'll help you take this to the next level. With Carla's help, Elliott began crafting a strategy to release the story in phases, ensuring maximum impact. The plan included exclusive interviews with the victims, a press release detailing the evidence, and a comprehensive report on Elite Aviation's practices. The calm before the storm. By the time the sun set over Nassau, Elliott and Miranda had laid the groundwork for a campaign that would expose the truth about Elite Aviation. The villa's living room was quiet, the hum of their laptops, the only sound as they finalized their plans. Miranda looked up from her screen, her eyes meeting Elliott's. We're almost there. Elliott nodded, his expression resolute. This is more than a fight for justice. It's a fight for change. And it's one we're going to win. As the night deepened, Elliott stepped out onto the villa's balcony, gazing at the dark ocean stretching endlessly before him. The challenge ahead was immense, but so was his resolve. This wasn't just about righting a personal wrong. It was about dismantling a system that thrived on exclusion and creating a future where dignity and fairness prevailed. For the first time since the confrontation at the terminal, Elliott felt a sense of calm. The storm was coming, but he was ready to face it head-on. The storm breaks. The sun rose over Nassau, casting warm light across the villa's pristine white walls and lush gardens. Inside, Elliott Harper stood at the kitchen counter, nursing a cup of coffee as he reviewed the latest updates from Miranda. The quiet hum of the ocean beyond the windows was a stark contrast to the whirlwind of activity happening behind the scenes. Miranda appeared, her laptop under one arm and a stack of printed documents in the other. She set them down on the counter with a determined expression. Everything's in place. The legal team has finalized their position on the NDAs, the forensic accountant has traced the financial cover-ups, and the coalition with Carla Reyes is ready to roll. Elliott nodded, his gaze steady. And the victims? Are they prepared? They're nervous, but committed, Miranda said. We've briefed them on what to expect. The media outlets are lined up for exclusive interviews, and the Center for Corporate Justice is coordinating the timing of the press release. Elliott took a deep breath. The weight of what they were about to do settled heavily on his shoulders. This was no longer just a fight for personal vindication. It was a battle for systemic change. Let's move forward, he said firmly. This ends today. The press release. At precisely 9:00 a.m., the Center for Corporate Justice issued a press release titled Exposing Discrimination in Elite Aviation, a Culture of Exclusion. The document detailed the patterns of prejudice uncovered during Elliott's investigation, backed by financial data, victim testimonies, and internal emails from Elite Aviation's management. Within minutes, major media outlets picked up the story. Headlines blared across news sites and social media. Elite Aviation accused of systemic discrimination. Whistleblowers speak out against private aviation giant. Billionaire Elliot Harper takes on corporate prejudice. Elliot's phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, messages of support, requests for interviews, and, predictably, statements from Elite Aviation's PR team. He ignored most of them, focusing instead on the live coverage. Miranda sat beside him, her fingers flying across her keyboard as she monitored the response. "It's gaining traction faster than we expected," she said. "Even outlets that normally stay away from these kinds of stories are picking it up." Elliot leaned back, watching a live segment from a major news network. The anchor was interviewing Carla Reyes, who passionately detailed the findings of the investigation. "This isn't just about one company," Carla said, her voice steady but fiery. "It's about a culture of elitism and exclusion that permeates industries catering to the ultra-wealthy." Elliot Harper's bravery in speaking out has opened the door for a larger conversation about accountability and justice. The public reaction. Social media exploded with reactions. The #FlyFairNow began trending within hours, fueled by stories from other passengers who came forward with their own experiences of discrimination and mistreatment at private terminals. A user posted, "I've always thought something was off about Elite Aviation. Glad someone with influence is finally taking them to task." #FlyFairNow. Another shared, "As a black executive, I've faced similar treatment at luxury establishments. What Elliot Harper is doing gives me hope." #FlyFairNow. But there was also pushback. Supporters of Elite Aviation dismissed the claims as isolated incidents or attempts to damage a reputable company. Some comments were outright hostile, accusing Elliot of using his influence for personal gain. Elliot read the responses with a stoic expression. He had expected resistance. Change was never easy, especially when it threatened entrenched power structures. The response from Elite Aviation. By noon, Elite Aviation released a carefully worded statement. Elite Aviation takes these allegations seriously and is committed to conducting a thorough internal review. We deeply regret any negative experiences and are working to ensure our policies reflect our commitment to diversity and inclusion. Miranda scoffed as she read the statement. Textbook damage control. They're hoping this will blow over if they say the right buzzwords. Elliot's expression darkened. It won't. Not this time. Shortly after, a leaked internal memo from Elite Aviation reached the media. It revealed a frantic attempt to manage the fallout, with executives prioritizing investor relations over genuine accountability. The memo's dismissive tone further fueled public outrage. A personal face to the fight. That evening, Elliot agreed to sit for an exclusive interview with a major news anchor. The setting was simple, a neutral backdrop, soft lighting, and Elliot seated opposite the interviewer in a tailored navy suit. The questions began gently, touching on Elliot's rise to success and his motivations for speaking out. But as the interview progressed, the tone became more probing. "What do you say to critics who claim this is a personal vendetta?" the anchor asked. Elliot's expression remained calm. "This isn't about me," he replied. "This is about a pattern of behavior that affects countless people who don't have the platform or resources to fight back. I'm in a position to expose it, and I feel a responsibility to do so." The anchor leaned forward. "Some might argue that this is just how luxury industries operate, that exclusivity is part of their appeal." Elliot's gaze sharpened. Exclusivity doesn't have to mean exclusion. When a company uses its policies to humiliate and marginalize people based on their race, gender, or perceived worth, that's not luxury. That's discrimination. The ripple effect. Over the next few days, the fallout for Elite Aviation intensified. Major clients began to distance themselves from the company, citing concerns about its reputation. Corporate partners paused negotiations, including a high-profile Department of Defense contract that had been weeks away from finalization. Victor Leighton, the CEO of Apex Aeronautics, issued a public apology during a hastily arranged press conference. His demeanor was contrite, but Elliot and Miranda saw through the performance. "This isn't over," Elliot said as he watched the broadcast. "Leighton is only apologizing because he's losing money. If we stop now, they'll rebuild their walls and keep operating the same way. A commitment to change. As the public pressure mounted, Elliott and his coalition launched the next phase of their campaign. A proposal for an independent oversight board to review policies and practices across the private aviation industry. The proposal called for transparency in hiring, stricter anti-discrimination measures, and mechanisms for holding executives accountable. The plan was met with widespread support, not only from advocacy groups, but also from clients within the industry who had long felt uneasy about its exclusivity. A moment of reflection. One evening, as the villa grew quiet and the waves lapped gently against the shore, Elliott stepped out onto the balcony. Miranda joined him, holding 2 glasses of wine. "To the fight," she said, raising her glass. Elliott smiled faintly. "To the people we're fighting for." They clinked glasses and stared out at the ocean, the horizon glowing faintly in the moonlight. The battle was far from over, but Elliott felt a sense of accomplishment. They had turned a moment of humiliation into a movement for justice, and the ripple they had started was growing into a wave of change. A new dawn. The days following Elliott Harper's explosive revelations were a blur of activity. Calls, interviews, and strategy meetings consumed every waking moment, and the ripple effects of his campaign against elite aviation were beginning to reshape not just the company, but the private aviation industry as a whole. In the villa's spacious living room, Elliott sat at the head of a makeshift conference table, surrounded by his team. Miranda was to his left, flipping through pages of reports, while Carla Reyes and 2 other representatives from the Center for Corporate Justice joined via video call. The air was heavy with anticipation as they prepared for their next move. The power shift. Elite Aviation's board is in full crisis mode, Carla said, her voice steady but tinged with satisfaction. They've convened an emergency meeting to address the fallout. I have sources saying Victor Layton is under immense pressure to step down. Miranda raised an eyebrow. Step down. That's the least he should do. He engineered this culture of exclusion. Carla nodded. Agreed. But it's a start. Public pressure is mounting. Investors are pulling out, and the Department of Defense has officially suspended negotiations on their contract. Elliott leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. What about their internal review? Are they making any real moves to change? Or is this more smoke and mirrors? Carla glanced at her notes. They've hired an outside consultant to audit their policies, but it feels performative. No concrete actions have been announced yet. Elliott's jaw tightened. Then we keep the pressure on. If they think a few hollow gestures will satisfy us, they're mistaken. Miranda spoke up. We also have a new development. Fletcher, the former employee who came forward, has sent over more documentation. Internal memos, meeting notes, and emails that directly implicate Layton and other senior executives in discriminatory practices. Elliott's eyes narrowed. That's exactly what we needed. With those documents, we can move beyond allegations and present undeniable proof. The public reckoning. The next day, Elliott held a press conference in Nassau. The setting was simple, a podium set against a backdrop of palm trees and the clear blue sky. Journalists from major outlets filled the space, their cameras trained on him as he stepped forward. Dressed in a tailored navy suit, Elliott exuded calm confidence. He paused for a moment, letting the murmurs of the crowd fade before he began. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Today, I stand not just as an individual who has experienced injustice, but as a representative of countless others who have faced similar treatment. The investigation into elite aviation has revealed a pattern of systemic discrimination, supported by internal policies and perpetuated by its leadership." He gestured toward a screen behind him, where excerpts from Fletcher's documents appeared. Emails from senior executives, financial records, and quotes from victims scrolled across the screen, painting an irrefutable picture of elite aviation's practices. This is not an isolated incident. Elliot continued. It is a culture of exclusion built on arrogance and sustained by silence. That silence ends today. The crowd erupted into questions as he stepped away from the podium. Miranda took the microphone, handling inquiries with her usual efficiency, while Elliot retreated to the wings, his mind already on the next step. The collapse of a giant. In the days following the press conference, the impact was immediate and devastating for Elite Aviation. Share prices plummeted as more clients severed ties with the company. High-profile figures who had once praised the airline now distanced themselves, their public statements condemning its practices. Victor Layton released a video statement, his usual polished demeanor replaced with visible strain. "I take full responsibility for the failings within our organization," he said, his voice heavy. "Effective immediately. I am stepping down as CEO." The announcement sent shockwaves through the industry. It was a victory, but Elliot knew it wasn't the end. Rebuilding the system. With Elite Aviation in disarray, Elliot turned his focus to the broader industry. Alongside Carla Rice and other activists, he spearheaded the formation of the Fair Skies Initiative, a coalition aimed at creating accountability and transparency within private aviation. The initiative's goals were ambitious: independent audits of all major private aviation firms, mandatory diversity training for staff, and the establishment of an independent body to handle complaints and enforce anti-discrimination policies. "We can't stop at one company," Elliot said during the initiative's inaugural meeting. "This is about transforming an industry and ensuring that no one else has to face what we've uncovered." The personal impact. Amid the chaos, Elliot finally found a moment to reconnect with his mother. They sat on the villa's balcony, the sun setting in a blaze of orange and pink over the ocean. Evelyn Harper sipped her tea, her gaze thoughtful. "You've done something remarkable, Elliot, but I hope you're not carrying this burden alone." Elliot smiled faintly. "I have an incredible team. And people like Miranda, Carla, and James Chen. They've made this possible." Evelyn reached over to place a hand on his. "I'm proud of you, not just for what you've achieved, but for how you've chosen to use your success. You could have walked away, but you stood and fought." Elliot nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. "I couldn't let it go, Mom. Not when I knew I could make a difference." Evelyn's smile widened. "And you have. But don't forget to take care of yourself in the process." A new chapter. As the weeks turned into months, the effects of Elliot's actions continued to ripple outward. Elite Aviation's new leadership pledged sweeping reforms, and the Fair Skies Initiative gained traction, with other industries taking notice of its success. For Elliot, the experience was transformative. It had reminded him of the power of resilience and the importance of using his platform to uplift others. His fight against Elite Aviation had started as a personal battle, but had grown into something much larger, a movement for justice, equality, and lasting change. Late one evening, as he sat in his study reviewing updates from the Fair Skies Initiative, Miranda knocked on the door. "Long day?" she asked, stepping inside. Elliot chuckled. "A long few months, but worth every second." Miranda smiled. "We've come a long way." Elliot nodded, his gaze distant but hopeful. "And we're just getting started." As the night deepened and the villa grew quiet, Elliot allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The journey had been exhausting, but it had also reaffirmed his belief in the power of action and the strength of community. He wasn't just building a legacy, he was building a future. And for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace.